The Confederates never saw it coming. It was 3 in the morning on May 13, 1862. The white officers of the CSS Planter had gone ashore for the night, tired, comfortable, and completely unaware of what was about to happen. Robert Smalls had been waiting for exactly this moment, not for days, for years. He fired up the boilers, gathered his crew, and then sailed a Confederate military vessel, loaded with weapons, loaded with cannons, loaded with classified documents, straight through the most heavily armed harbor in the South. He wore the captain's straw hat. He sent the correct coded signals at 2 heavily armed Confederate checkpoints, Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie. Both let him pass. And when he finally crossed into Union waters, he pulled down the Confederate flag and raised a white bedsheet. He was 23 years old. This wasn't luck. This was strategy. People hear this story and think, what a brave man. They're right, but bravery alone doesn't get you through 2 Confederate checkpoints in the dark. What got Robert Smalls through those checkpoints was something far more powerful than courage. It was preparation. His years of exemplary service in Charleston Harbor had earned him the trust of his white Confederate superiors. They let him pilot the Planter. They left the ship in his hands when in port. They never questioned him, never doubted him, because he gave them no reason to. While they saw a loyal, skilled pilot, he was memorizing every signal, every checkpoint protocol, every pattern in the guards' routines. He wasn't performing obedience, he was building his escape, one observation at a time. That's not just bravery, that's the kind of cold, strategic thinking that wins wars. The plan that had no room for error. The key to the escape was timing. Smalls and the other enslaved crewmen had to find a moment when all 3 of the Planter's white officers would be off the ship simultaneously. One officer staying behind meant death for everyone. Smalls knew that the Planter's captain occasionally broke Confederate policy, so he and his officers could spend evenings with their families in Charleston. The opportunity finally arrived on May 12, 1862, when all 3 officers, tired from a week's absence from the city, went ashore for the evening. Smalls didn't rush. He and his co-conspirators waited anxiously for several hours before setting sail in the early morning hours in order to pass Fort Sumter at first light, because approaching in total darkness would arouse suspicion. Think about that for a moment. He was sailing a stolen Confederate warship through enemy waters, and he was timing it to arrive at the most dangerous checkpoint at sunrise, not to hide, but because the light would make his disguise more convincing. That's not desperation, that's mastery, what he carried with him. Smalls couldn't afford to buy his family's freedom before the war. He needed $700, money he didn't have. So he told his wife to be ready for whenever opportunity dawned. Around 3 a.m., he sailed to a nearby wharf to pick up his waiting family members. In total, 16 people, men, women, and children, made that crossing. This wasn't just a man escaping. It was a man refusing to leave anyone behind. He risked everything, not just for himself, but for every person on that ship. And he did it with the kind of precision that left no room for panic, no room for mistakes, and no room for failure. He and his men had no intention of being taken alive. Either they would escape or fight, and if necessary, sink the ship. Free or die, that was the only equation. The North erupted. When news of the escape broke, the New York Herald called it one of the most daring adventures since the war commenced. Congress awarded Smalls and his crew half the value of the Planter as prize money. Smalls traveled to Washington to meet with President Abraham Lincoln and helped persuade him to permit black men to serve in the Union Army. Shortly after that meeting, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered 5,000 formerly enslaved men to fight for the Union. One man's escape didn't just free 16 people, it helped open the door for an entire army. Rear Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont wrote that Smalls was superior to any who have come into our lines, intelligent as many of them have been. Meanwhile, the Confederacy placed a $4,000 bounty on his head. That bounty tells you everything you need to know about how dangerous they considered him. Captain, Congressman, unstoppable. In 1863, while piloting the ironclad USS Keokuk during the Union's bombardment of Fort Sumter, the vessel took heavy hits and was eventually sunk. Smalls's bravery was rewarded with command of the USS Planter later that year, making him the first African-American captain in U.S. Navy history. After the war, he didn't retreat into a quiet life. Using prize money from the capture of the Planter, he purchased the mansion of Henry McKee, the man who had once enslaved him, during a tax auction. Suddenly, this formerly enslaved man found himself not only a war hero and national celebrity, but the property owner of a planter's mansion. He bought his own master's house. Let that land for a second. Then he went into politics. He served in the South Carolina House of Representatives, the state Senate, and then won 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, fighting to integrate the Army, pushing for equal accommodations across state lines, and standing firm against every effort to strip Black Americans of their right to vote. In 1864, while in Philadelphia, Smalls was arrested for riding in a segregated streetcar. In response, he organized a boycott that ultimately led to the desegregation of Philadelphia's entire transit system. The man never stopped fighting. Not on the water, not in the halls of Congress, not anywhere. What Robert Smalls actually teaches us. History tends to flatten people like Robert Smalls into symbols. The brave slave who stole a ship, a feel-good story, a footnote. But if you look closer, really look, you see something far more instructive than bravery. You see a man who spent years studying the system that oppressed him, understanding it so thoroughly that he could turn it against itself in a single night. You see a man who planned in silence, executed without hesitation, and never once let fear replace strategy. You see a man who, after winning his freedom, immediately turned around and fought for everyone else's. Robert Smalls didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for conditions to improve. He didn't wait for someone to hand him an opportunity. He created his own. In the dark, on stolen water, under enemy guns. He died in 1915 in Beaufort, South Carolina, in the same house where he had been born into slavery. He had come full circle. But nothing about his life was circular. It was a straight line, driven forward by intelligence, by discipline, by an unshakable refusal to accept the limitations others placed on him. He once said, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." He didn't ask for an equal chance. He took one. Now, here's a question for you. Robert Smalls had every reason to give up, and 0 reasons to believe he'd survive that night on the water. But he moved anyway. What's one moment in your life where you chose to move forward even when the odds were completely against you? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one.